For today is a fairly straightforward one. We're going to be reviewing some of the accounting reminders very briefly, and then getting into best practices for decision analysis first, and then more in detail getting into best practices for Monte Carlo modeling. The application to cost-loaded schedules will be our final item. We'll have time for roughly 15 minutes of Q&A. So feel free to add questions using the GoToWebinar control panel. There are two sections that I monitor during the broadcast here, the questions section and the chat function. So feel free to use either one to drop me a question as we go forward. But in the meantime, let's get started. My basis of experience is really using Defender, the software tool that I developed a little over 20 years ago, to look at environmental liabilities. That's all we use Defender for. Defender is an Excel-based and Access-based as well as a web-based software tool that's now used by about 14 corporate user teams who've gone through about 60 audits by their internal and external CPAs. We've looked at roughly 2,000 unique liabilities. There's about 2,800 sites in total that we've looked at, but in terms of Monte Carlo modeling, 2,000 unique liabilities that we put in at least one assumption to, and we've done detailed deep dive analysis on about 200 different projects. We've also been supporting 4 U.S. port authorities in managing their pollution remediation obligations, which is the public sector analog to environmental remediation liabilities. And we've also developed some cloud-based credit counterparty tracking and project control systems. I've got 2 business degrees, one from Northwestern, another from Georgetown. So again, I want to underscore, not an attorney, not an environmental engineer or an earth scientist or CPA. My work and experience has been my guide in developing this presentation today. So just a little bit about the accounting reminders. Foremost, number 1 is ASC 410-30, which is a restatement of documents like SEC Staff Accounting Bulletin 92, AICPA SOP 96-1, FASB 5 et al. It's a roll-up that occurred starting roughly in 2008 and became fairly stable in around 2010. So it's the definitive reference point for how to state what are now called environmental obligations. ASTM 2137-06 is the current iteration, -06. That is a standard guide produced by the American Society for Testing Materials. I served on the committee that drafted this standard in 2000 and 2001. So I've got a very close knowledge. I probably have it memorized somewhere in the back of my brain. Foremost is the chart that the graphic from that standard in the lower right, which says there's a hierarchy. Having no estimate is the low end of the hierarchy, the lowest quality response to the need for accurate, disclosable, decision-specific numbers, and a quoted price is the best at the upper end of the robustness, comprehensiveness scale. So a couple reminders about generally accepted accounting principles. We're looking for expected value, present value, fair value. Expected value meaning we take in and weight, and we create the weighting of a variety of outcomes and perform robust cost analysis on each of those. Present value, we have the opportunity, but not necessarily the obligation, to state our reserves and make our decisions. We have an essential duty to perform our decision making on a present value basis. And finally, on a fair value basis, in an arm's length transaction in an orderly market, what would another party charge us to take on a liability? That's got to be the basis of generating environmental liability forecasts. Expected value, meaning it's a robust number. Present value, it's brought back to today's dollars. Fair value, it's as though another party were going to take on the liability from us. A good way to think about environmental liabilities comes from US EPA's guide to developing and documenting cost estimates during the feasibility study. And it's just basically the idea of a funnel diagram. The less you know, the more uncertainty you have around an estimate. And as you go through certain key phase gates or go through a structured decision-making process, and there are several of them out there marketed to Fortune 500 companies, as you go through phase gate decisions, the range of expected outcomes snaps down accordingly. However, there is still a necessity to account for variable change, and part of that is why we're here today. To go back to ASTM 2137-06, I just want to point out that part of the aspect of variable change is to account for what are decisions differently from how you account for variables. And here you'll see the way that this decision tree is structured, and this is an extract straight from figure X 2.2 in ASTM E2137, is this actually mixes up variables, uncertainties, and decisions. And so it treats them all equally, and that's okay for a starter, but it's in terms of performing serious decision analysis, those are things you would pull apart and state differently. So moving forward on here to get into our best practices about decision analysis, the second portion of our presentation today. First and foremost, it's important to brainstorm with stakeholders about variables, the rate of change of those variables, particularly probability, cost, correlation with other variables, the statistical things that you'll want to revisit every year and make sure that are stated accurately, comprehensively, robustly, rigorously first off. Ensure that the decision analysis work is done on a fit-for-purpose basis. Focus only on future decisions. Don't relive past decisions and try and combine past decisions with future decisions to complicate the work. Stick to projects where the expected value of perfect information, that is the delta between opportunity A, alternative A, and alternative B, is at least $1 million. If there isn't $1 million of value to create, spending $50K on a decision analysis effort or much more when factoring in everyone's time is probably not going to be an effective effort. Consequently, focus in on decisions where there's $1 million at risk, and you should be able to use DA effectively on a prioritized basis. To go back to the brainstorming is the next point. Determine the range of cost outcomes, and this is where some work gets short-shrift in my experience. Determining the range of cost outcomes usually focuses in just on one aspect, and that's picking a remedy and using, in a sense, EPA's guide or a RCRA facility investigation, using numbers that are just based on choosing technology A and timetable A with technology B and timetable B, technology C and timetable C. That's important to do, absolutely essential to doing good decision analysis. However, additional factors need to come into play. Different variables include remedy failure, counterparty failure, and endpoint change. Those endpoints include cleanup goals and future use of properties, some of which have control by the owner, some of which never will. Finally, use formal meetings. Formal meetings include a respect and adherence to a phase gate decision-making process, and again, when it's time to make a decision, document it and move on. Decision analysis does not work for every site. It's important to not assume competence. Tools and objectivities are absolutely going to be acquired skills. If you were able to get a copy of the Deepwater Horizon report, an expert panel reviewed the root causes and consequences of the Deepwater Horizon event several years ago. One of their findings was the team that was performing the analysis about what to do with the events as they unfolded. They had the very best tools. They had the very best experts one phone call away. They had the very best computers. They had the very best in telecommunications equipment. Unfortunately, they didn't have the experience to know what they were looking at and know how to handle that. And that's important to remember that Crystal Ball, at risk, Monte Carlo modeling tools, Excel, they're very democratic tools. They do exactly what's instructed of them. However, issuing the proper instructions at the proper time and in the proper sequence is a learned skill. It's an acquired skill. I'd also underscore that focusing on remedy selection is one of the aspects that clients and contractors may need to communicate about, may need to get on the same page. In various lookbacks, in other words, of root cause analyses of why costs for environmental projects went well beyond budget, it's usually a degree of control and imagination. If a consultant is given the responsibility to, quote unquote, tell me everything that could go wrong, they'll deliver that. They'll have a basis of experience and perform the research and deliver on that. However, if they're just told, give me the plus or minus range around the remedy we're going to go ahead with, they won't be doing detailed DA. They won't be doing detailed Monte Carlo modeling. They'll really just be doing exactly what they're instructed. So again, it's a strong leader, weak follower situation where the communication cycles can get shut down pretty hard, and that condemns an end user, again, by not asking the right question, to repeat the learn, forget cycles. Our third slide on best practices in decision analysis include that problem statement and framing is absolutely pivotal. Identifying what's in scope, what's on the frame, and what's out of scope is pivotal to knowing what problems are going to be fixed and what will not be addressed through the decision analysis activity and through the solutions that are proposed. Decision criteria or decision priorities need to be stated next, and that'll go back to how a team ranges and scores strategic alternatives, and then define as well who's going to own a decision. Strategic alternatives in turn need to be brainstormed and scored and validated in order to perform these steps appropriately. Here's a graphic of some of the key tools that are useful and pivotal in doing environmental liability forecasting and doing strategic analysis. I'll just go about these in more or less a random order. But starting in the upper left, decision framing helps take all of the possible issues and alternatives and out of that chaos create clarity around what will be solved and again what won't be solved. Going to the lower left, SWOT analysis includes reviewing for each selected or available opportunity the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as they occur to the project team so that they're documented, and as more knowledge comes in, that the SWOT analysis reflects current thinking, not simply a legacy thinking at one point in time. An influence diagram in the center of the graphic refers to how pushing up or down on costs or control of one aspect of a strategy affects others. You may find that if you understand the cost of landfill disposal, great, that's one part. Landfill disposal costs plus transportation plus the unit costs for transportation costs, as well as the distance to the landfill. Those all form together the aggregate costs for disposing of soil. Understanding all of those components is pivotal, and an influence diagram helps make that thinking transparent so that in turn a project team is able to make sure that they're not skipping over any steps and misusing any experience that's come from similar sites. In the lower right corner is decision hierarchy to score and evaluate a range of strategic alternatives so that there's focus on appropriate activities, that there's not a micromanaging of future remedies, and not that there's such a high level of approach, a 30,000-foot approach, if you will, that nothing of tangible, concrete value is generated from a decision analysis review. The final item in the upper right is a strategy table, which is a numerical explicit scoring, also typically with color coding. I apologize for the example. It's from a casino website that's looking at the game of 21. But I just want to show that the strategic alternatives are more or less clear in that game and provide a handy basis for perhaps what you might use as a laminated card to identify what are good ways of going about things, what are bad ways of going about things, and the red, yellow, green color coding certainly does help with that. At this point, we'll move on to the next section of our presentation regarding decision analysis, but just as a quick overview, I wanted to give a sense of how the two are different from one another. Probabilistic modeling's key tasks have to do with looking really closely at costs in the next several years, approaching the closing of a project, the closing of a site, and assuming that the costs need to be modeled to a range of accuracy. Typically, plus or minus 30% plus 50% is appropriate for a project that's in the remedy evaluation, remedy selection stage. Meaning, if the expected remedy is going to cost $1 million, that the low end of the range should be $700K, perhaps less. The upper end of the range should be $1.5 million, perhaps more. There should be wider ranges for brand new sites that are just entering the portfolio that haven't had any characterization work done or any remedial investigations completed. The ranges in turn mean if you're expecting $1 million cost, low end of the range $500K more or less, upper end of the range $2 million or more. Very robust wide ranges. So again, if a client, a Fortune 500 client, is talking to a consultant and asking the right questions, communicating, in other words, the expectation that the range should not be plus or minus a contingency of 25%, which is fairly standard for a bid, but instead should be basically a comprehensive life cycle cost forecast, allowing for forgiveness and allowing for negative outcomes. A contractor will know that they're not being judged on the expectations of their ability to perform work to budget, but instead are delivering an expectation of various unknown unknowns coming to play when remedial projects go through the study phase and go through remediation. A common hazard in performing this work, this is the school of hard knocks talking, is neglecting to correlate assumptions because Monte Carlo tools do exactly what they're told to in Excel. If you put in 3, 4, 5, 10 different variables, the effect if they're uncorrelated is they will cancel each other out and you'll have an estimate that's plus or minus 10% and perhaps not understand why until more detailed analysis is done. Under DA, the separate tasks are fairly distinct from probabilistic modeling. It's important to make good discerning judgments about what is a cost versus what's a decision, what's an uncertainty, and what is going to be controllable. So again, uncertainties have to be pulled apart and quantified and bracketed, and they have to be characterized separately from decisions. The way we structure our Defender software takes that into account so that we're not automatically incorporating decisions and uncertainties. We put decisions into what we call different cases, including the reserve case, and we allow for uncertainties to be modeled with crystal ball and at risk. So I'll convey that in a few minutes here. But basically, the point that you're working toward is the next bullet point, to test and develop a range of workable alternatives, similar ways to satisfy similar liabilities. You're looking at perhaps the comparison of mature versus emerging technologies, local versus national contractors. But at any rate, you're looking for a range of strategies that can resolve the problem that you built the frame for. Making the timing explicit is absolutely pivotal. Regulators are not regularly enforcing timetables. That's a transition in the environmental field in the last, since the Great Recession in the last 7 or 8 years. So it's important to be transparent about the lack of urgency if that is the case. So again, that's the breakdown of how we get the dividing line between what probabilistic cost modeling is as opposed to structured decision analysis as applicable to environmental liabilities. So in order to get to some good results and perform good analysis on Monte Carlo modeling, we feel that it's very important to centralize the assumptions, document them all in a single place, a single page. We use what we call an assumption table, and that uses the different decisions, which we call, as you see on the far left edge of this slide, case R for the reserve case, case 1, a different strategic alternative, a different creative doable alternative, case 2, and case 3. So we again pull the assumptions off of different worksheets, centralize them on a single worksheet so that we're able to compare them. Next columns over, we use the P10, P50, P90 to bracket each of those assumptions. Those are developed through a Delphi or Socratic process typically. Basically question and answer, talk through if the project team believes that those are likely in 1 out of 10, 9 out of 10 circumstances like the site. So we test for that, we ask for that, we probe for that, and that in turn means we can use the expected value column over to the far right. We're able to use that with crystal ball and perform Monte Carlo modeling because we've got documentation of the P10, P50, P90. So again, if we ask good questions, we get good answers. We ask no questions, we get no answer. So the process includes, as you see, the call-out boxes, transparent bracketing, line items, work breakdown structure, line items, and unit costs that are built out for bracketing, and then explicitly calculated expected values. This also makes it easier to correlate the assumptions, a process that I'll state in a little more detail further on. Where those numbers came from is this next slide, and the title of this guy is Best Practice Number 2, Standard Work Breakdown Structure, which means every site needs to go through the same work breakdown structure so that the project team has the sense that they're looking at every liability in a similar way. Far too often, we've seen that consultants are charged, environmental consultants have been charged with generating an environmental cost estimate. They generate one from scratch in Excel and then convey it to the client, who then has a unique spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet, in turn, doesn't look like any other spreadsheet generated by any other consultant for any other project. And that, in turn, is the challenge of ensuring consistency across a portfolio, is you have perhaps some line items that are an essential part of some forecasts, and those same line items may be completely left off or omitted from other forecasts. Those can be costs, for example, the cost of remedy failure, the cost of project overhead, external and internal legal expertise, and counterparty risk of default. So the structure that we've got here is pretty much how Excel was meant to be used. First column lists the line items in the work breakdown structure. The second column lists the code from the ASTM work breakdown structure. It's a public domain work breakdown structure that we find works pretty well. The next several columns are for specific years, laying out specific costs. So that enables a calculation of expected cash flow forecasts, which are obligatory under GAAP, best practices, ASTM 2137, and most of all, common sense. We found again that pulling out the expected values, which I've got highlighted in blue in the lower right, pulling out those expected values, having them linked and modeled in a separate sheet enables for simple, crisp Monte Carlo modeling. So the takeaway at the bottom is a standardized work breakdown structure will separate costs from study, for remediation, for O&M, overhead, and legal, and keep those costs separate one from the other. Recovery rates will also be kept distinct and will be applicable to one or more PRPs and insurers. So again, it's important to use the same work breakdown structure throughout, to use multiple cases to convey different decisions. But again, that's how our software has been built for about 20 years. The next practice, this is best practice 3 out of 4, is to choose the proper distribution type. Crystal Ball and At-Risk are built more or less identically. They're the two major tools that function as Excel add-ins, so that the most commonly available public domain tools, they've both been available for roughly 25 years. They're very robust, very capable, produce reproducible results, auditable results, and they're somewhat too simple to use because they allow for a novice to very quickly apply information that requires some group perspective. But anyway, let's move into to how to use the specific distributions. The most commonly used distributions in our experience are the normal, triangular, and log normal distributions. Got them ranked there in the priority order. That's the order that we see them used most commonly when someone is just trying out, because they're naturally just the most intuitive. They're the easiest to understand. If you plug in a low and a high to a bell-shaped curve or a normal distribution, you get out a normal distribution on the back end. If you know a low, mid, high, you use a triangular distribution and you get a low, mid, high forecast. We'll go over each of these in a little more detail, but there's a little more to using these in environmental remediation, environmental liability forecasting. First and foremost, money does not behave as a normal distribution. Money sometimes behaves as a log normal distribution, but it generally doesn't conform to those top 4 distribution types: normal, triangular, log normal, and uniform. They don't act that way. An experience scattergram would show that numbers are not behaving, environmental costs don't behave in accordance with those 4 distribution types. They instead behave like beta, Weibull, beta PERT, and other more complex distributions, which in turn take more thinking. But I'll just go over each of these in a little more detail further on in the presentation. Best practice number 4 is keep the focus where it belongs, which is creating a reliable estimate, not rushing through the job, but performing the job so that the estimates are reliable. The estimates will be used in MD&A activity, reserve forecasting, budgeting, so rushing through the estimate has its direct consequences, all of them negative. Working through a reasonable range of alternatives, of course, is pivotal. Splitting decisions away from uncertainties, risks, variable change, very, very important. Systematically working through the entire work breakdown structure, making sure that a comprehensive estimate is performed on a rigorous basis. Being realistic about timing, which includes the probability of enforcement or non-enforcement, remedy failure, whether it is likely or impossible, does need to get explicitly stated. Pulling that information into a cost-loaded schedule is a newer requirement for companies that are using cost monitoring or cost reporting as a basis for paying vendors. So it again becomes more useful throughout projects as that's when and if that's a project metric. Finally, adding ranges in for achievable outcomes means the ranges do need to be wide enough to incorporate the cost of failures I mentioned a second ago, and project risks do need to be connected through statistical correlation. So let's dive into each of those distribution types and talk a little bit about how we can see those applied. Uniform distribution makes the statement that there isn't a better estimate within this range. And that distinction was very important going back to the mid-70s when FASB 5 came out, to 1996 when SOP 96.1 came out, because it explicitly said reserve the low end of the range if there's no better estimate within a range. So having a uniform distribution explicitly stated, guess what? There isn't a modal value that's any better or any worse than any other number. Consequently, they're all equally likely. Therefore, I should reserve at the low end of the range, even though IFRS 13, IAS 37, these are the international accounting standards, would tell me reserve at the middle of the range. Just take the low and the high, cut them in half, average them out, and use the middle of the range. That's the world that we're headed to, but the world we've come from with FASB 5 and SOP 96.1 put a premium on having this tool be able to generate a uniform distribution. The tricky part about using a uniform distribution, to step back and editorialize for just a second, is if you're putting a uniform distribution in and trying to get, if there's gaming going on, gaming an environmental reserve number, you can spot it from pretty far out because it just takes one assumption that's not a uniform distribution to generate a probabilistic estimate that's got a peak to it, that's got a modal value that's more likely than any other value. In other words, if you put in a uniform distribution with the gaming expectation that you're going to try and get a low end of the range for the entire site, every single assumption that goes in, every single uncertainty has to be characterized the same way with a uniform distribution, which I've yet to see happen in real life. There's inevitably one assumption where something is more likely than something else. However, again, there's a conscious effort. This is more or less advice to an auditor. If you want to see gaming, look for a cost forecast that's got only uniform distributions, because that's, again, an attempt to say none of these numbers from P1 to P99 is any more likely than any other. Look how smooth and straight that probabilistic S-curve forecast is. Uniform distributions are part of that, but again, you put in one normal distribution, one log normal distribution, that will create a kink in the curve, that will create a middle of the range number that's more likely than the others. And again, that's part of what I've been exposed to and could see as a source of potential manipulation. So in the example below, just to move on forward, if the study costs in 2001, in case 1 below, are going to have a minimum of 25K and a maximum of 75K, that's exactly how this will look. The user types in the box in the lower right corner, minimum 25,000, the lower right corner, maximum 75,000, and hits enter, which is a part of the display I've truncated off here. Crystal Ball will do the rest and generate an arithmetic mean of 50K, and therefore that assumption is now locked in. Moving forward to a triangular distribution, this is most useful for getting users to think about how to bracket assumption their first time. So it's, again, a good training basis for getting a team to build a consensus. In this example, the minimum cost will still be 25K, the maximum cost will still be 75K. However, the user or users believe that the most likely case is dead set in the middle of the range. Therefore, the resulting expected value after typing in those three values at the bottom of the screen, min, likeliest, and max, is an expected value, an arithmetic mean, a weighted average, all of which means the exact same thing, of $50,000. A more complex distribution type to use, but one that we found is fairly intuitive and fairly quick to use, is to put in the P10, P50, and P90 values, and then have the crystal ball tool generate, in other words, interpolate and extrapolate the remaining values outside of those three assumption points. So in this example, we think there's a 10% chance the cost of this line item will be $15,000 or less. The P50 or median value, half the values above, half the values below. The median value will be 50K, and the 90th percentile, in other words, 90% chance it'll be that number or less, will be $100,000. So putting those three assumptions in at the very bottom of this crystal ball data entry block, this data entry window, 15K in the P10 box, 50K in the P50 box, and $100,000 in the P90 box. Hitting enter generates this curve with an expected value, an arithmetic mean, a weighted average of $54,523. It will generate it every time. You put it in at-risk or crystal ball, it'll generate the exact same number every time. That's the great part about these tools, is a user doesn't have to guess what number or wonder whether the same number will be generated on one person's laptop versus another. It's statistically guaranteed that the same result will come out of the same assumptions going in. The next assumption type that we find is very useful is using a custom distribution, and it's most useful for either-or events, like the remedy will work, the remedy won't work. There will be an issue with trucking the soil off-site, there won't be an issue with trucking the soil off-site. In this case, we're going to say that there's a 60% chance that the cost will be exactly $25K, 40% chance that the cost will be exactly $75K. And this is where the logic kind of jumps off the page for a user team. No other values other than 25K or 75K are expected. However, Crystal Ball will tell you, put the number in the cell at 45K. Don't put in the most likely number, which is 25K. Don't put the optimistic low end of the range of 25K. Put in the weighted average. This fundamentally is the difference between SOP 96.1, which allows you to put in a low end of the range, and IFRS 13, IAS 37, which are the international accounting standards that we're looking like we're trending toward in the next 2 years. Fundamentally, organizations that are estimating their environmental obligations or pollution remediation obligations, whether they're in ASC 410-30 or GASB 49, is they're going to have to look at looking at the weighting probabilities out and looking at reserving the middle end of the range, the weighted average or arithmetic mean. In this case, the 45K versus neither the 25 or the 75K. Next step to perform after putting the assumptions into this is go through a process of statistical correlation. Why? As I mentioned before, uncorrelated assumptions behave randomly. They cancel each other out. They perform more or less like stocks and bonds in an IRA. Their behavior tends to offset one another. So a user could put in aggressively wide ranges, minus 50 plus 100%, very, very aggressive wide ranges. Put in 5 assumptions, 10 assumptions. My favorite is seeing 30 or 50 different assumptions, reflecting a lot of thinking and labor on the part of the person putting the data in. When a user hits go on at-risk or crystal ball, at-risk and crystal ball will cancel those independent events out because it's treating the software tool is treating those events just that way. Normally, events are correlated. When a cost goes up in one area, it usually drives costs up in another area, or coincidentally will be observed going up in another area. That's getting away from cause and effect, but just saying coincidentally, when costs go up in one area, they'll go up in another area. That's generally how environmental liabilities, that's how they behave. When you're spending more on a soil remedy, you're probably going to be spending more on a groundwater remedy and spending more on studying it, spending more on O&M. Projects just generally tend to grow in scale. They also tend to go the other direction as well. They tend to shrink in scale concurrently. So all assumptions generally are what's called statistically positively correlated. One is going to have a synergistic impact on another. The degree and direction of correlation are useful topics for discussion, conversation, testing, running multiple iterations of models, and that's a neat capability that's been added on in the last 25 years as laptop computers enable a project team in real time to be able to test and monitor the volatility of assumptions more or less by doing a run, waiting 30 seconds for that run to be completed, pulling up the forecast charts and the tornado charts related to the forecast, and see the impact of assumptions that they just generated. This work used to take hours earlier on in the 80s. It used to take days, and by hand was out of the question. Now this information is more or less trending toward being done on a tablet, being done on a phone. So the point is being able to do this work quickly on a desktop with Excel and Monte Carlo tools like Crystal Ball and at-risk enables a user to be able to again, reach a consensus and see the cause and effect, and that's what everyone is after. Clarity for a reliable, defensible model, which means doing solid work on correlation. This is where the core of the thinking has got to be done, making sure that not only key variables are bracketed, but also that the correlations are done right. On to the next, which is identifying some candidates for correlation. This is a slide I usually pick up when we have some discussions about what sort of items need bracketing. We found through trial and error that, for example, when there's higher spending on monitoring wells, when more wells are put in, annual lab costs are going to be going up. Again, because you're putting in place more physical structures into the groundwater to collect more samples, you're inevitably going to be collecting more and sending more off to a lab. So that's, I think, an intuitive, logical response to seeing higher monitoring well costs yielding higher lab costs. The negative correlation, if you have more monitoring wells, is that you may have fewer years of groundwater pumping treatment. In other words, if you're expanding the operations and maintenance duration, you're probably, if you're adding more wells, you're probably going to be able to count on finishing the groundwater remedies sooner. Let's just step back for a second and say if you're just putting in more monitoring wells to collect more data, you still haven't got the problem identified. That's something else altogether. But if you're in a late stage and adding additional wells, you're probably in a position to declare either technical practicability or that remediation essentially has been complete. Another example of spending more and seeing a positive correlation is soil excavation and staging leading to higher soil transportation and disposal costs. In other words, moving dirt around a site typically leads to additional costs for moving the dirt around, moving the dirt off-site and perhaps sending it off to a landfill. The negative correlation for soil excavation and staging is if you're working on the soil remedy, you may be able to save money or count as a savings. The duration of the size of the system and the duration of the O&M for the groundwater pumping treat system, if one is even indicated on the site. For moving on to the next slide, if there's higher spending on the groundwater pumping treat capital, in other words, if a larger system is built with a higher throughput, higher capacity, more tanks, additional piping, and so on, you can expect higher utilities. You can also, coincidentally, probably expect higher losses due to vandalism, theft, and periodic maintenance, just because of the size of the system. The payoff, or the negative correlation, depending on your perspective, is the number of years of pump and treat may be less because you're pumping out the aquifer or pumping out the contaminated groundwater that much faster. Definitely there are arguments out there for pumping slower is more cost effective, more time effective, and more scientifically effective in terms of source removal. There's an expert named Nigel Goulding, a very interesting fellow. If you Google him, Nigel Goulding is at a company called EHS in Ohio. He's done some incredibly useful, innovative research about slowing down the pump and treat volume and showing that that actually yields greater source removal. So again, there's a fine-tuning process out there. It's not a linear process that I'm trying to present in this table, but instead identifying that there are cause and effects out there that a project team needs to be aware of, think through, and then display their thinking process. The next line item is if more money is being spent on soil cleanup, project team should expect additional or higher costs for project management. Because again, a larger, more extensive soil remedy will have additional safety issues, shoring issues, additional time, perhaps additional vendors, more trucks, more community interaction, and so on. The final item is a slurry wall in 2010. This line item is based on some research that MIT did for the environmental community. Back in 2002, it did a survey of slurry walls and found that every single one of them that were ever installed for environmental containment and management, every one of them had failed. The joints going vertically down to the groundwater table, through the groundwater table into any bedrock, and then going laterally connecting with any other slurry wall joint, those are complexities that are right now beyond practice. Consequently, any slurry wall that's in there in place will highly limit the volume of contamination moving around, but it won't hold back everything. As a consequence, a slurry wall in 2010 will most likely mean a new slurry wall in 2015 if it's meant to be an essential part of containing source material. So let's move on to how the process of correlating assumptions just specifically works, and here specifically I'll just use crystal ball. After an assumption is put in with the line, in this case we're using a Weibull distribution. We've got numbers in for our 10th, 50th, and 90th percentiles. In the 10th percentile we've got 25K, the 50th percentile we've got 55K, and the 90th percentile we've got 80K. After that we hit enter, and while we're still looking at the very same screen, a second later we hit the correlate button, and the screen in the lower right pops up. And what that does is it allows us to do a couple things very fast with basically just 3 or 4 buttons. First, it lets us choose which assumptions we want to correlate to one another. And that can be one, or it can be several, or it can be all of the assumptions that are inside of a given Excel file. So the first step is to choose the assumptions to correlate. So again, if you're choosing monitoring wells, you may choose to correlate that with the groundwater pump and treat duration. The next is to identify whether there's a positive correlation, that means the cost will move up and down together, or a negative correlation. Spending more in one will directly be offset by spending in another. The next activity before fixing on a rate is to figure out whether it's a perfect 1.0 correlation or if it's a modestly strong, like a 0.8, if it's a modestly weak, like a 0.5, or it's a fairly neutral, like a 0.2. Putting something in there, testing it, going back to this window, changing the number and trying again. These are inevitably parts of what a project team does to zero in on what the tails of a distribution on a forecast for a project look like. Is by tweaking these correlation factors, a project team is normally trying to get to what is an intuitive answer and seeing the cause and effect of using this tool accordingly. Once all of the assumptions are in, the user simply hits either in the lower left corner of this window, either enter or OK. But in this case, we're seeing the impact of putting a 1.0 correlation is all of the dots on the screen in the lower right corner really just line up. Spending more on groundwater, the groundwater issue on the horizontal axis means directly spending less money on the vertical axis. So again, that's how the correlation function works. In this case, we're going to repeat the process, but use several different assumptions. Again, here we start back with the first capability of choosing the assumptions, which allows for the second window on the left side to pop up, where a user picks out the assumptions that are of interest, and then in turn identifies the correlation efficient that applies to each one. So again, you're saying, we're on one cell, we're using one cell as our basis for correlation, and then we're connecting 2 other assumptions to that, and that's how the 3 are correlated together. Again, if we edit the factor and use a number other than 1, we get away from the green line. As you see on the right side, in the upper right, we've got a -1 coefficient. In the lower right, we've got a +1 coefficient. That display is just entirely appropriate and normal for having a 1.0 coefficient, whether it's +1 or -1. If we put in a 0 correlation coefficient, which again there's no point to doing it, but it's just what I want to do here is just display what it would look like. You'd have basically every number behaving at random in pure Monte Carlo or Latin hypercube modeling, just behaving entirely at random. And that's again a reference point to put in if there's a use of saying we explicitly think there's no correlation between these 2 factors, but that's really frankly what's in there by default, so there's no need to manually go through this process. But I just did want to display what a 0 correlation looks like. Moving on to the next section of looking through distribution types. Here in this Weibull distribution, we've got a P10 of 0, that's in the upper half of the screen, a P10 of 1 million rather, a P50 of 1.5 million, and a P90 of 2.5 million. That in turn generates an arithmetic mean or a weighted average of 1.649 million. And that number in turn takes a little bit of reminding to a project user team that a P50 is not a weighted average. A P50 is just simply a median. There's no other definition for it. However, we're after an expected value. The best number that we're after is not the median value, is not the P50 value. The number that we're really after is the arithmetic mean, the weighted average, the expected value. All of those terms mean the exact same thing. And we're after that number, that's the 1.649 million. That's what we're after. We use those other 3 to get to it. We're also able to use, to move on to the next section of our presentation, we're also able to use this data inside of Microsoft Project, use this very same tool, Crystal Ball and At-Risk perform inside of MS Project and allow for ranging of not just the financial values, but also the dates. so that a user is able to see about not just the range of cost outcomes, but the duration outcomes that are possible. So in this case, we've got not just the cost modeled, but we've also got the 175 days for remedial design and facility design engineering, that duration modeled with a minimum duration of 75 days, a likeliest duration of 150 days, and a maximum duration of 300 days. We're not modeling cost directly. We're simply showing the duration of the task itself. And that, in turn, is, again, an intuitive aspect of managing projects, but it also goes to drive accuracy in the overhead costs and seeing if there are any, again, synergistic impacts in increasing the duration on one component of a project, primarily due to this entry, and seeing what the impact is on the life cycle cost of the project. In turn, once those inputs are put in, and here I've got just those two assumptions that I've got circled in red with the green font. Those two circles in the center of the slide are our assumptions, and that in turn feeds to our forecast, which is our total cost and also total day forecast. That in turn is what we've got displayed in the lower right of this slide, where we've got a P10 value of 2.249 million and a P90 value of 4.276 million. That range, articulating that range, is something that, again, Crystal Ball and MS Project, At Risk, and MS Project do identically. It's important, however, that a project team pick one tool as the assumptions that are generated in one, either Crystal Ball or At Risk, don't show up in the other tool. In fact, there's a very easy process for corrupting those assumptions just because of the technology that they each respectively rely on. So again, it's important for a project team to standardize that on the tools, whether they're Microsoft Project, MS Excel, Crystal Ball, At Risk, and others. There are some great tools out there. They're meant to generate reproducible results, and again, it's a matter for a project team to make their choice accordingly. At the end of the day, we're always after a display like this. In the lower right box, we've got the percentiles displaying the P0 all the way through to the P100 values. This is, again, a useful reference point for a project team that's trying to understand what's the lowest possible cost, what's the maximum possible cost that I've got displayed. And then it goes back to the fundamental point of all of our activity, which is displaying this information on an expected value basis. And for that, we need that number that's right in the middle of the range labeled mean, the $3,154,000 number. That's the number that we're really after. And that coincidentally is also displayed in the box, the table in the upper right corner, where we have the number of Monte Carlo trials and the arithmetic mean listed. One point I want to point out is Crystal Ball and At Risk are absolutely great for recording the number of trials. In our experience, it takes, if there are 4 or 5 assumptions at least, it generally takes at least 2,500 trials to get a good Monte Carlo simulation. It's the difference between running a model for 30 seconds versus a minute. But if there are more than 5 assumptions, there's probably some thinking or screening that needs to be done by a project team to get to a reasonable and accurate project cost range. We find that some eager users, when they use a Monte Carlo tool, will put in 20, 30, 40, 50 different assumptions in, and be surprised when none of them show up as having any statistical significant impact on the cost forecast. That's simply a matter of the learning curve. It's being able to spot the highly leveraging variables far out. And Crystal Ball and At Risk provide a great tool for doing that. They provide this. They provide a tornado diagram that lets a user on the back end say, okay, here is what my expected value was. Some of these assumptions, some of these Crystal Ball and At-Risk assumptions, these Monte Carlo modeling items, had a big impact on what the cost range was for this project. Others didn't really have an impact at all. It doesn't mean that they were significantly larger or smaller costs. It means that the standard deviation around them, combined with the magnitude of the cost, had the biggest impact on expected value for the full project. Consequently, this can be a little counterintuitive and a little bit of a learning curve for all the users to say, you know, I thought tank demolition and vessel demolition, the line items at the bottom of this table, were my most expensive line items. How come they're showing up at the bottom of this list? It's, again, not that they're high cost or low cost, it's their volatility relative to their cost. that's really being displayed in the tornado chart. So again, the way to read this is if the top and bottom end of the range number for the disposal costs occur and everything else is held constant, that the expected value will swing down to around 450K or may swing up to 610K on the top end, just because of this one variable. In other words, disposal as a line item has a 100K swing into it, up and down. So it can swing the project cost up or down by 100K. To continue on down to vessel demolition, the upper and lower end of the range is if vessel demolition goes well, it only means saving 5K. If it goes badly, it'll only add 5 or 10K to the project cost. Again, that context helps a project team understand how it's bracketed these items to begin with. It gives them a chance to quietly go back and redo their assumptions if they don't see these matching up with intuition. Gives them a chance to redo the correlation. So again, this is not a final waypoint. This is a reality check. This is a step that's useful for a project team to step back and say, did I do my work properly? Is this what I would intuitively expect? Or did I do something that doesn't reflect common understanding or activities on similar sites? When all of this work is done well, the project forecast, the Monte Carlo tools will generate what's called an S-curve, which will provide a financial breakdown between the low end of the range, which is the vertical scale probability, the horizontal scale on cost. It'll mean numbers start in the lower left corner and go to the upper right corner. So these are referred to as cumulative distributions. They replace the bell-shaped curve, which are frequency distributions. But it's the very same data, and we're looking here at 4 or 5 different cases. I can just count 4 colors here. 4 different cases of looking at the cost elements and identifying how they behave from the first percentile all the way up to the 100th percentile. And here provides a basis for a project manager to make a decision about what has the lowest achievable or the optimal achievable expected value. One point about displaying this information is most every environmental project you might ever see, every environmental project has a negative NPV. In other words, most of the numbers will trail off to the left. Again, it's an important and rational part about managing environmental liabilities to look at them as cost leaders or cost projects that cost an organization. However, the display does need to sometimes periodically be flipped to reach some clarity about what is the most likely, what is the P10 and the P90, what is optimistic and what is pessimistic. So that's just a point of caution from our experience in using S-curves. Everyone that uses an S-curve for a second or third time usually has a comfortable degree of fluency about being able to tell at the P10, the low end of the range, the P90, which forecasts are more reliable. That relates to the slope of the forecast. A very reliable forecast has a more vertical slope. A less reliable forecast, it's just the opposite, splays out quite a bit from the low end of the cost range to the high end of the cost range. A user is able to also articulate from the points that are drawn in there, which are the expected values, and identify if the expected values are above the P50 value, above the median, or below the median. And again, there's different interpretations, different analyses that come out of seeing that a number is very widely skewed or has a big difference. There's a big delta between the P50 and the expected value. That's essentially a very, very important point in communication. It does explain that a cost forecast has a lot of uncertainty embedded inside. When all this information is aggregated, and this is where we'll conclude our presentation today, when this information is aggregated together, you see that the software doesn't allow for aggregation of a portfolio of tornado diagrams, a portfolio of Monte Carlo assumptions. And we found this in turn is useful for a single large site that has many component projects inside of it. Typically this will be a pipeline or a refinery site, but it's also useful for looking at a disjointed aggregated portfolio of distinct liabilities being reviewed in an MD&A or reserve forecasting scenario to ensure that a project team understands which projects have more uncertainty embedded inside, which projects are inherently riskier and may need additional resources. So we find that aggregating this information above to a portfolio level not only helps with capital stewardship on individual sites and good decision analysis, but also helps with staging and sequencing the portfolio accordingly. With that, that wraps up our presentation. We're at about the 55-minute mark, but we don't have any questions in the question section or the chat feature of the GoToWebinar control panel. So we'll leave it at this for today. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like more information, take a look at our website at erci.com. Please join our LinkedIn group. Drop me an email at john@erci.com if you'd like more information about a needs analysis, about what you can learn from performing Monte Carlo modeling, or more likely, training a team to use Monte Carlo modeling to model environmental liabilities more accurately. It's one of our passions, one of the activities we've been doing for more than 20 years. We'd love to share our experience with you. If you'd like a PDF or original PowerPoint version of this presentation, please drop me a note, as well as an attendance certificate or a copy of the link to the on-demand webinar, which we're going to be posting on the GoToWebinar website. We've been recording this presentation today, and that's the version that we'll be posting up there as well. If you'd like authoritative copies of ASC 410-30, GASB 49, IAS 37, please drop me a note. I'll send you their website so you can see the current authoritative versions from their copyright holders. Be glad to share those links with you. Finally, we've got future upcoming webinars on GAAP for environmental liabilities, how to conduct an environmental reserve review meeting, as well as repeating this presentation and demonstrating our counterparty defender software. We hope to see you at one of these presentations soon. With that, our question queue is clear, and with that, I'll end the presentation. And thanks for joining us.